I want to start off by just thanking Maggie, who's off preaching somewhere in another church today, Maggie and Pastor Kim for leading worship last week here in my stead. I really, really appreciate that. I was away last week visiting my in-laws. So I want to tell you just a little bit about my in-laws. There's so much to tell. But whenever I visit my in-laws, we always have these epic battles over what to watch on TV. Does that happen? Is that just my family, or anybody else have that issue? So we all have, different preferences about what kind of movies and shows that we like to watch. And after about an hour of scrolling through the movies, we argue the merits of each film or each series, and then someone will get worn down, and we will finally negotiate an imperfect truce and start watching something, right? And of course, everyone's a little bit unhappy with the outcome. So we all have our passive-aggressive ways of expressing our discontent. Some of us, this is my tactic, just fall asleep. Some of us make fun of the movie until we get shushed by somebody else. And then there's one family member, who I will not name, who will sit on the couch with us, put in their headphones, and actually watch a completely different movie on their iPad, right there with us. The Flippins are a tough audience. But this trip, my sister-in-law, she was prepared. So she had pre-selected something she thought we would all like. You may have seen it advertised everywhere. It's this series called Jack Ryan. Anybody seen this? It's starring Jim Halpert from The Office. I don't know his real name, but y'all probably know him from The Office. It's one of those dramas about the white American CIA agent man who outsmarts the terrorists and saves the women and children from the horrible fates. And my sister-in-law, she won the victory. And we got sucked into that series, and we watched all 8 episodes in 3 days. And a lot of it was this, I'm not endorsing this. A lot of it was this kind of American patriotic propaganda, right? But there were a few more complicated plot lines. There was this one scene that seemed relevant for today's message, so I'm going to tell you about it. And of course, I can't watch TV without finding Jesus somewhere. So this is where I found him. So in this series, Jack Ryan is kind of this goody two-shoes guy who's also kind of judgy about other people who aren't as goody two-shoes as he is. Does anybody know anybody like that? And they exist. And at one point on the quest to catch the mastermind terrorist, Jack and his boss have to work with this guy in Turkey who is working in human trafficking, right? And Jack is just openly disgusted by this guy, and he shows his disgust for this man's work by being really, really smug to him. And the man at one point turns to Jack and just says, "You don't like me. You think you're the good guy, and I'm the bad. Maybe you're right. But maybe if I was born in a nice American city, I could be the good guy too." Deep, right? Jack Ryan, deep moments. But it's kind of true. It's kind of true. We don't get the backstory of this guy, but he's working and he's living among refugees who are fleeing war and terror. And he implies that he has not had the same opportunities that he assumes that these American good guys have had. Now, I'm not suggesting we give all of our empathy over to human traffickers, but I think that what he is saying is that in the world, we make these judgments about people. And we actually label people good and bad. And sometimes we're conscious of it and we can defend it. And sometimes we're not conscious of it. But a lot of our judgment of good and bad deserving and undeserving really is a judgment on how much access people have had in their lives to privilege and wealth. My daughter has this Madeleine children's book about these little girls who I guess live in a boarding school. I haven't worked it all out. But it starts out like this. Join in if you know it. In an old house in Paris that was covered with vines lived 12 little girls in 2 straight lines. In 2 straight lines they broke their bread, brushed their teeth, and went to bed. They smiled at the good and frowned at the bad, and sometimes they were very sad. I think sounds like a few others have read that book too many times. So it's an okay book, but there are these pages on the good and the bad that are a little messed up. So when it says they smiled at the good, it shows these 12 little girls like looking at this fancy-dressed princess or queen lady who's standing there with this fancy horse. And then when it says frowned at the bad, it shows a burglar running off with a bag of money. And I'm like, I see that, stealing is bad. That's a good thing to teach the kids. But I wonder, if it's more complicated, like maybe this person had a hard life and had hard choices to make about how to get resources in their life. But the label of good for the woman is, from what I can tell, solely based on her appearance of wealth. Why is that good? I mean, how did she obtain that wealth, Was it because her family owned slaves and had generations without having to pay for their labor? Was it because her ancestors acquired power and wealth by beheading wives and overtaxing poor people's teeth? Or was it because she invested in subprime mortgages that targeted poor people of color and she just made a killing? I have a lot of questions about this lady's wealth, I don't think she should be assumed to be good just because she's wearing fancy clothes. FYI, it's hard for me to read children's books. But it's not just children's books, right? We make these kinds of judgments about people all the time. It's normal in our world. If a well-dressed, straight, cis white man walks into a room wearing expensive watch and shoes, he will be treated differently from a trans woman of color who walks in with tattered clothing and hasn't had access to a shower in a week because her parents kicked her out of the house. Imagine those two people walking into a bank or a restaurant or a police precinct or even into a church. Before they have said a word or done a thing, we look at the way somebody is dressed, how they present themselves, and we figure things about their resources and their situation. But we go further than that, don't we? We use that information to ascribe a moral judgment on them. We use that information to decide how likely they are to be a good guy or a bad guy or a competent guy. We use that information to decide whether they deserve a lot or a little from us or our communities. Or do they deserve to be treated with suspicion and contempt and a smug attitude? And sometimes, if we have enough power in this situation, we might get to decide if they deserve the benefit of the doubt, or a second chance, or a shot at the job, or if they deserve to be separated from their children, or defunded in their public schools, or shot 16 times in their own streets. Now, none of this is news to any of you, right? It's been a thing forever. And it was a thing in the first churches. In today's reading from the letter of James, the writer talks about a scenario in which a person with gold rings and fine clothes comes into the assembly, And a poor person in dirty clothes also comes in. And the church folks take notice of the one wearing the fine clothes and say, "Have a seat here, please." While to the one who is poor, they say, "Stand there," or "Sit at my feet." So the well-dressed, well-to-do person is shown to a seat, a chair, a couch. And the poor person is told to stand over there, or if they're lucky enough to be allowed to sit, they're supposed to sit on the dusty floor. But that was normal, you know? That was a thing that was normal in society. Now, that was a different culture, of course, from ours. We in America would never tell someone where to sit or where to worship based on some kind of privilege, would we? You know, I've been trying to learn a lot about the history of First and Summerfield, actually, lately, so that I can brag on us to everyone I see. Because we have a really very beautiful history as a community. Many of you know that history. And we are not perfect. I ran into this interesting fact lately that the Varick Memorial AME Zion Church over on Dixwell was formed in 1818 by African American members of First Methodist Church, which is one of the churches that would eventually become First and Summerfield. Now that's kind of a cool piece of our history, right? A proud connection with Varick Memorial AME Zion. You might say that we planted that church. Members from one of our ancestral communities formed that church. That is so cool. I was really interested in this, and so I checked out Varick Memorial's website, and there's this wonderful history of the church on their website. And sure enough, they mentioned that members of First Methodist Church founded that church. I want to read to you what the Varick website says about the history. It says, the First Methodist Church of New Haven was assigned a staunch segregationalist as its minister. A part of the congregation were 35 slaves who were made to worship in separate quarters of the church and were denied communion, and further were discouraged from taking any active role in the liturgy of the church. Those slaves longed for religious freedom. At risk of severe punishment, these slaves continued meeting with AME Zion ambassadors and organized a formal congregation. It's different. Now, I don't want to rag on the ancestors of this faith community. Trust me, I am one of First and Summerfield's biggest fans. This church has changed my life, and many of you have had the same experience. But we as communities and we as a nation will never be what we are called to be if we do not understand the whole truth of our histories. We cannot gasp in self-righteousness when we hear that a church that invited people into its doors told the privileged people to sit in fancy seats and had the oppressed people stand to the side or sit on the dirt floor. We cannot be self-righteous when we hear about that, because we've done it. All of us do it in one way or another. It's been done to us in one way or another. The writer of James calls this different kind of treatment of different kind of people partiality. The Google definition of partiality is unfair bias in favor of one thing or person compared with another. Partiality happens every day. It is normal in our world. But the author of James says, sure, that's normal. You can do that. But if you do that, you are not a Christian. Because here's the thing, y'all. In case you haven't caught it yet, we are not normal. we're not supposed to be normal. If you are a follower of Jesus, you're not supposed to do just what they do out in the world. You're not supposed to do what you're taught to do by society, because maybe you didn't catch this, but the world is messed up. It might seem normal, but treating privileged people better than oppressed people is messed up. You see, because it's so normal, we sometimes forget that. But the author of James is like, privileged people are not more deserving of anything than oppressed people. Privileged people are not morally better than oppressed people. In fact, it's often the opposite. The author says, why are you giving the rich people the seats? Is it not the rich who oppress you? Is it not they who drag you into court? Is it not they who blaspheme the excellent name that was invoked over you? Now, I don't really understand all that was happening in that community. I don't know exactly what's been going down, but something was going down. And it wasn't the rich and the privileged who had the moral high ground in whatever that was. Later, the letter of James has this whole long, crazy curse of the rich people. You guys got to read this. This is your Sunday afternoon reading. And at one point, you can almost see the letter, like the paper itself, like bend over and lean into the rich person, looking into the distance with its hand on its ear. And it whispers in this like creepy voice, listen. The wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out. And the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of God. So that's a little bit more specific about one of the reasons that the rich may have been cursed in that community. And that's also one of the reasons we have labor unions and immigrant rights groups meeting in this building. The author of James is also like, these are the people who steal your wages. Why are you giving them the seats and making the people they steal from to sit on the floor? That may be what people do all the time, but you know there is something really wrong with that, right? Now, I'm not preaching some Marxist revolution here today, this morning, I don't think. No one's saying that people who are privileged are all horrible and people who are oppressed are all perfect. I mean, to be honest, we're all in some complicated spectrum, right, of privilege and oppression, and we all act good on some days and we act bad on some days. But it is to say that if we are going to call ourselves Christian, we have got to cleanse ourselves of these ideas of the world that give more respect and more authority to people who have and less to people who have not. That is not our way as Christians. There's so much more to say about all of this. But for today, let us work to create communities that truly follow Christ, so that when 12 little boarding school girls in 2 straight lines come into this sanctuary, they get the same treatment as 12 little boys and the same treatment as 12 little public school kids. Let us create communities that teach our children to smile at the good, which is nothing less than loving our neighbor as ourselves. May it be so. Amen.